All the Young Dudes, James' Perspective by Stay in Dreams. Chapter 5. First Year, Potions. Friday, the 10th of September 1971. By the end of the first week of lessons, James had already made his mark. He'd used up all the dung bombs his dad had given him, started a broomstick duel, which McGonagall wasn't too pleased about, and discovered that not all house elves were as patient with his antics as Gully back home. He supposed it wasn't a bad start, all things considered. The lessons themselves were, well, a bit of a mixed bag. They were mostly introductory, and while Lily Evans spent each class furiously scribbling down pages and pages of notes, like she was trying to rewrite Hogwarts history by hand, the rest of the class didn't seem too fussed. James certainly wasn't. Magic had always come naturally to him, and he figured he'd get by just fine without overdoing it on the homework. Charms was allowed. Professor Flitwick, a tiny block who could probably fit in James's school trunk, had enchanted a pile of pine cones to whiz around the room, to everyone's delight. After a few attempts at the spell, Lily managed to levitate her pine cone about 3 feet in the air. James was impressed, though he'd never admit it. Sirius, naturally, had to one-up everyone by getting his to spin like a top until it shut off and smashed right through the window. Meanwhile, James, Peter, and Remus had less luck, and James quietly vowed to beat Sirius next time. There was no way he was going to let his best mate have all the glory. Transfiguration was another story entirely. James had been looking forward to it, but it turned out to be much more serious than he'd expected, thanks to Professor McGonagall. She was all business, no nonsense, and there would be no practical work at all during the first week. She had them doing tons of homework instead to gauge their ability levels, as she put it. James couldn't help but feel a bit deflated. He'd been hoping to turn Peter into a tart, not write essays. Then there was History of Magic, which was an absolute bore. Professor Binns droned on, reciting dates and battles in a monotone that could put even the most energetic student to sleep. He set them 2 chapters of reading as homework, which Sirius scoffed at, muttering to James, "Surely everyone's already finished a History of Magic. It's kid stuff." James nodded along, though he hadn't actually read it. His dad kept a copy in his office at home, but every time James had tried to pick it up, he'd ended up getting distracted by Quidditch magazines instead. Potions, at least, promised to be more hands-on, but there was a catch. They had to share the class with the Slytherins. James had been doing his best to avoid the Slytherin lot. They walked around like they owned the place and didn't seem to have a sense of humor between them. Professor Slughorn, however, was surprisingly cheerful, which lifted James's spirit a bit. Slughorn was reading through the register when he got to the beast. "Black. Sirius. Aha! There you are. Quite surprised at the sorting, my boy. Quite surprised. I've had every one of the blacks in my house since I started teaching. Shan't take it personally. Young Sirius, but I shall be expecting great things." Sirius looked like he wanted the ground to open up and swallow him whole. James shot him a sympathetic look as Slughorn continued calling out names. "A Potter and a Pettigrew, eh? Well, well, along with Mr. Black there, this class has quite the pedigree, eh?" James frowned slightly. Slughorn seemed to be playing favorites, doling out compliments to a select few students. He hadn't said anything about Lily, for instance, and that sort of favoritism left a bad taste in James's mouth. "Let me see, Lupin! I knew your father. Not one of mine, but a damn good duelist. Nasty business." The whole class turned to look at Remus, who seemed to shrink under their attention. Most of them knew his dad had been a wizard, but that he'd been raised by muggles in a children's home, whatever that entailed. Remus had never seemed inclined to share much about his past. Thankfully, Slughorn didn't linger on the topic. He wanted to get them started on practical work as soon as possible. Best thing to just get stuck in, he beamed. Now, if we all forward to a cauldron, you can all take in turns to follow the steps. There was a mad scramble as everyone tried to pair up. James, Sirius, and Peter quickly claimed the cauldron at the very back of the room. James glanced over at Remus, who was still standing by himself. He was just about to call him over when a new voice piped up. "Mind if I join you, lads?" James turned, half expecting just another Slytherin, but was relieved to see it was Nathaniel Quince, a familiar face from back home. Grinning, he welcomed Nathaniel to their group, though he couldn't help but feel a bit disappointed that Remus hadn't joined them. When he looked back up, he saw that Remus had paired up with Lily, along with that greasy-haired kid from the train, Severus Snape, wasn't it? And some blurry bloke named Mulciper. James didn't recognize the name, but he was pretty sure his parents wouldn't have approved. Having established that Remus wasn't alone, James turned back to his group. He opened his book so the others could see and quickly took the lead, directing Peter to start crushing thistles and telling Quince to measure out snail-eyed stems. Sirius, of course, decided for himself to steer, while James read from the book and instructed him on how many times to steer and in which direction. For practical work, it was a bit of a letdown. Unlike charms, there weren't any immediate results, just a lot of waiting for the potion to brew. Still, James was keen to see what they could come up with. "Let's try adding the powdered newt and see what happens," Sirius suggested, elbowing James with a mischief grin. Peter frowned. "The ingredients don't call for powdered newt, though." "Yeah, but wouldn't it be fun to see what happens?" Peter's frown deepened, and Sirius rolled his eyes. James glanced between the two of them, whitening his options. The idea was tempting, but he was more concerned with keeping the peace between his friends. "Maybe we should save the experimenting for after the first class, Sirius? Wouldn't want to blow up the classroom on the first day." Sirius didn't get the chance to respond, because at that moment chaos erupted. A few tables ahead, Remus had suddenly lunged at Snape, landing a punch right on his nose. James's eyes widened in shock. He'd never seen anything like it. Remus, usually so quiet and reserved, and now throwing punches like he knew exactly what he was doing. It was all action, no hesitation, as if this wasn't the first time he'd been in a scrap. Remus didn't have the upper hand for long, though. Mulciper yanked him off Snape and landed a heavy punch to his face. James took a step forward, ready to jump in and break up the fight, but Slughorn's bellowing voice stopped everyone in their tracks. "Stop!" Everyone froze. The portly professor stormed over. "Get up, both of you!" he shouted at the boys on the floor. Snape and Remus slowly climbed to their feet, chests heaving. Snape looked the worst rare, with his hair all mussed up and blood dripping from his nose. Remus, on the other hand, had a nasty bruise forming on his chin, but seemed otherwise fine. James let out a breath. He didn't realize he'd been holding. "Explain yourselves," Slughorn demanded. Both boys stared at the floor, silent. Mulciper stood grinning like an idiot, while Lily was on the verge of tears. James felt a familiar burn behind his own eyes and quickly blinked it away. He hated crying, hated showing vulnerability. How was he supposed to be the brave one if he was tearing up like a baby? "Very well," Slughorn said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Detention for both of you. 2 weeks. 10 points from Gryffindor and 10 from Slytherin." "Wait, what?" James couldn't believe it. "That's not fair," he protested, determination blazing in his eyes. "Should be twice as many from Slytherin. It was 2 against 1. From where I was standing, it was Mr. Lupin who started it," Slughorn replied curtly, shaking his head. "Still, You are quite right. Mulciper, 5 points from you as well for punching Mr. Lupin. Violence does not solve violence, you know, as I've told you oldest brother on a number of occasions. Miss Evans, please take Mr. Snape to the hospital wing. Lupin, you can clean up the mess you've made. The lesson was nearly over anyway. Slughorn had spent most of its talking role, so he dismissed the rest of the class. As they filed out into the corridor, the hall buzzed with excited chatter. Mulciper wasted no time puffing up his chest and bragging to the Slytherins that gathered around him, his voice oozing with self-satisfaction. Well, he's thick, isn't he? Couldn't even read the book. All Severus did was ask what they teach in Muggle schools. Oi! And who taught you to be such a prat, Mulciper? Sirius called out, not missing a beat. Maybe you can ask them to teach you how to throw a decent punch next time. From where I was standing, it looked like your mate Severus was the only one bleeding. James and Peter burst out laughing, joined by a few other Gryffindors who had overheard. Mulciper and his lot shot them murderous looks, but with Slughorn still lingering in the doorway of the potions classroom, they thought better of making a scene. James watched them slink away, his grin growing wider as they disappeared down the corridor. Typical Slytherins. Quick to start something, quicker to scupper when it didn't go their way. They hung back, waiting for Remus to finish cleaning up the mess in the classroom. James tapped his foot impatiently, glancing back at the door every few seconds. He knew Remus didn't like to draw attention to himself, and he hoped the poor bloke wasn't taking too long on purpose just to avoid them. He couldn't blame him, though. James himself hated getting in trouble, especially when it was in front of the whole class. But this was different. This wasn't just some prank gone wrong. Remus had actually ducked Severus, right there, in front of everyone. And that, in James's book, was worthy of a celebration. When Remus finally walked out, he looked a bit surprised to see them all standing there, like hadn't expected anyone to wait. For a split second, his expression was wary, like he was bracing himself for telling off. But then James couldn't help himself. He broke into a wide grin and punched Remus slightly on the arm. "Bloody brilliant, mate!" he cried, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "The way you just went for him!" Sirius chimed in, his tone full of admiration. "Mulciper was out there bragging afterwards, told everyone what Snape said. You were right to do it. What a prat!" Remus groaned, running a hand through his messy hair. "Told everyone." "Don't worry. They're all on your side," James reassured him, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "Well, expect the Slytherins." "Yeah," Sirius added, his grin as wide as ever. "And who gives a toss about the Slytherins? They're a bunch of wankers anyway.